The connection is secure. We can try it now.
It has to work. We can't stay here. It's getting too hot.
Her belly, heavy with a child that was due before the rains, pressed painfully against the metal fender of the abandoned vehicle.
Why now? Of all the places to break down, it had to be here.
Tools and fearful eyes, who had thrown up their hands and fled. They had said the car's soul had left it. She could almost believe them. The scent in the air was not burnt oil or gasoline, but something sharper, like broken earthenware and ozone. She reached deep into the impossible tangle of modern circuits and ancient, rust-colored dust. The sun, a brutal orange eye in the sky, was beginning its final, desperate plunge. She found the spot. It was a copper wire, thicker than her thumb, that ran from the battery to the main power unit. When she touched it, she didn't feel electricity, she felt a cold dread, like reaching into a dark well. This wire was not severed, it was rejected. Abibi watched, her breath catching in her throat, as a bead of fresh, synthetic engine oil, meant to cool and lubricate, slowly crawled backward out of the oil pan, not dripping, but retreating up the metal housing. It was an impossible movement, a rejection of its purpose, and it was the sign she had feared. The sleek, black beast of a car, owned by the city's most arrogant son, was not just broken. The spirit of the old road, the spirit of Ogun Forest, had claimed it. And soon, it would claim the man who dared to disrespect its path. Tell us where you are watching from, and also please, kindly like and subscribe to our channel, as this helps, and keeps us going, so we can share you more stories. Thank you. The black vehicle was named Sankofa, but its owner, Oba Akachi, called it the Beast. It was a fortress of steel and glass, a four-wheeled symbol of his absolute success in the gleaming, new city of glass towers. Akachi was the founder of Akachi Systems, a titan of technology who had replaced the old world's trade routes with lines of fiber-optic cable. The Beast had carried him over 2 continents and through 10 deserts, but now, on the ancient, forgotten dirt track leading to his ancestral home of Igboya, it lay still, coughing hot, metallic steam. Akachi, impeccably dressed in linen, stood beside it, radiating disbelief and fury. His sleek, city-hired mechanics had come and gone over 3 days, driven back by the heat, the lack of signal, and the bewildering nature of the car's failure. They had the latest diagnostic machines, computers that could speak to the car's brain, but the car's brain was silent, cold, and unresponsive. One mechanic, a fat man named Kalu, had packed his bags with frantic speed, muttering about a digital juju and a dead heart. Akachi refused to leave the Beast. Pride was a heavy cloak he wore, and abandoning his fortress on this dusty, primitive road felt like surrendering his entire empire. He had flown in parts from Germany, chartered a helicopter that couldn't land, and screamed into a satellite phone that kept dropping the signal. His assistants in the city were panicking, but Akachi was focused on the machine that failed him. He was a man who believed in logic, code, and profit. He had no time for juju or ancient roads. The local villagers, who occasionally passed him on their way to the well or farm, gave him a wide berth, their eyes full of pity and a deeper, unsettling knowledge. They knew this road was hungry, and they knew the difference between a simple breakdown and a sacrifice demanded by the earth. Akachi just saw backwardness, he saw people unwilling to help a fellow human. His rage was a tightly wound spring, ready to snap at the next person who dared to offer useless advice. Abibi lived on the fringes of Igboya, the small, proud village cradled by the whispering edge of Ogun Forest. Her small, mud-brick house was tucked behind the market, far enough that the judgmental eyes of the village could mostly avoid her, but close enough that their quiet disapproval was a constant, suffocating cloud. Abibi was a genius with eco, the traditional art of making, mending, and melding things. Her father, before he died, had been the only one who could coax life back into the old petrol lanterns, fix the village's aging grinding machine, or mend a broken hoe so that it was stronger than before. He had taught Abibi everything, the patience of the metal, the song of the engine, and the way to listen to the whisper of the fault. But the village saw only her unmarried state and the shame of her growing belly. In Igboya, skill was respected, but reputation was everything. The elders, led by the formidable MMA Zina, had quietly marked Abibi as unblessed. Her skills were a dark gift, they believed, too powerful for a woman who had failed to secure a husband before bearing a child. Now, she was desperately poor, relying on scraps of metal and meager payments to feed herself and prepare for the coming child. She needed money urgently, money for the midwife, money for the baby's cloth. Every time she walked to the well, the women would turn their faces away, their silence louder than a drum. Abibi had a fierce inner pride, inherited from her father, but even that was starting to crumble under the relentless weight of hunger and isolation. The news of the stranded billionaire and his magnificent, dead beast had reached her ears, but Abibi dismissed it. It was too far, too impossible. The city mechanics had failed. How could a poor village girl, with no education and no fancy tools, succeed where they failed? Mma Zina, the village matriarch and keeper of the old ways, sat in her compound, grinding dried kola nuts with slow, deliberate movements. Her wisdom was heavy, like the ancient stones of the riverbed. Her granddaughter, a curious girl named Kemi, had brought her the gossip. The man from the city, Oba Akachi, was stranded on the road, his expensive chariot a monument to his failure. Mma Zina did not smile, she simply exhaled a plume of dust. That road, she rumbled, her voice like gravel rolling downhill, has always demanded respect. It takes everything you value and holds it until you understand your error. She had known Akachi's lineage, a family who had forgotten the soil from which they grew, seduced by the loud, flashing lights of the capital. The failure of the city mechanics was not a surprise to Mma Zina. They came with books and wires, but no understanding of the land. The engine failure was a message, a punishment, not a technical glitch. Only one person in this village knows how to speak the language of iron and blood, Mma Zina told Kemi, her eyes glinting. But she is blinded by her own sorrow, and the village has made her silent. Kemi knew she spoke of Abibi, the pregnant woman with the magical hands. Mma Zina sent Kemi with a cryptic message, a half-joke wrapped in wisdom: tell the woman with the strong hands that the stubborn man with the dead machine needs a gift, not a repair. He needs to pay the toll of the road with humility, and she is the tax collector. This was the way of their people. Nothing was ever simple, nothing was ever a coincidence. Every misfortune was a lesson, and every fix required more than a wrench. Akachi had moved from fury to a cold, dangerous despair. The sun had set, and the road was swallowed by a darkness so profound it felt like the bottom of a well. The beast's powerful, expensive alarm system had gone off inexplicably 3 times, draining the last reserve battery. He sat inside the car, sweating, the leather seat suddenly feeling like a coffin. He was starving, thirsty, and cut off from the world. His power, which extended through markets and governments, stopped exactly at the edge of the dirt road. This was his first real, personal failure in a decade. He thought of the hundreds of millions he had spent to build Akachi systems, to make himself untouchable, yet here he was, touched by the dirt, the insects, and the chilling silence of the wilderness. He had tried everything the manuals and his engineers had suggested. He had even, in a moment of utter desperation, kicked the tires and screamed at the dashboard. Nothing. The car was a magnificent, 3,000-pound paperweight. As the moon rose, casting long, hungry shadows, he saw a flicker of light approaching. It was a small, flickering flame, carried by a slight figure walking slowly up the treacherous road. Akachi's heart leaped with relief. Salvation, finally. But as the figure drew closer, he saw it was not a rescue vehicle, not an engineer, but a solitary woman, walking with the heavy, uneven gait of late pregnancy. He sank back into his seat, the last sliver of his hope dissolving into bitter contempt. Kemi, Mma Zina's messenger, approached the intimidating black machine. She was just a girl, barely tall enough to see over the car's hood, but she carried the weight of her grandmother's authority. She found Akachi in a state of defeated, haughty exhaustion. He glared at her through the tinted window. Kemi didn't flinch. She tapped lightly on the glass with the small, dry branch she carried. Akachi reluctantly lowered the window just enough to bark, "Go away, child. I don't have water to give." Kemi delivered her message, word for word, in the ancient Igboya dialect. "The road is tired of carrying your pride, Oba. The one who speaks the language of the iron is needed. She requires no fancy tools, only your attention. Akachi stared at her blankly. What nonsense is this? Who are you talking about? I need a technician, not a witch doctor. Kemi pointed down the road, back toward the village, her eyes wide with conviction. The one they call a Bibi. She is the daughter of the first mechanic. She is the only one who can appease the beast spirit. But she will not come for mere silver. She comes for something more valuable. Akachi scoffed, but the darkness was too heavy, his failure too complete to fully dismiss the strange advice. He had exhausted logic. Perhaps a little madness was all that was left. He told the girl, "Go tell this Abibi. Tell her I will pay her family enough money to feed the village for a year if she can make this machine move an inch." Kemi delivered Akachi's offer to Abibi. It was twilight when she found her, bent over a sputtering kerosene stove, trying to boil a meager pot of water. Abibi's face, usually set in a mask of quiet determination, softened slightly at the girl's earnestness. But when Kemi relayed Akachi's arrogant promise to pay her family enough to feed the village, Abibi's eyes narrowed. "He offers charity," Abibi said, the word dripping with scorn. "He offers a handout to silence the poor, not a fee for a master's work." Her father had taught her that a craftsman's skill was sacred, and to accept an insultingly low payment was to dishonor the craft. She was poor, but she was not a beggar. She looked at her swollen hands, hands that could disassemble and reassemble a clockwork mechanism in the dark. She thought of her father, whose memory was the only thing she truly possessed. "Tell your grandmother and the city man this," Abibi instructed Kemi, her voice now steady and hard. "I will come, not for his silver, but for his word. If I fix his beast, he will not just pay me. He will tell everyone, from the first elder to the last merchant, that I, Abibi, the woman of the old road, saved his empire. He will acknowledge that I am a master. And if he ever dishonors me, or my skill, or my father's memory, the spirits of the road will claim him completely." It was an oath, a high-stakes gamble. Kemi ran back to deliver the chilling terms. The sun rose on the fourth day, illuminating Akachi's misery. He was covered in dust, his fine linen shirt now ripped at the shoulder, the stench of sweat and failure clinging to him. He was a picture of a dethroned king. Kemi returned, breathless, but her eyes held a new, unshakable respect. She relayed Abibi's chilling message, the demand for acknowledgement, the scorn for his charity, and the chilling oath. Akachi's initial reaction was laughter, a dry, bitter sound that cracked his throat. Who was this insolent woman? Who dared to set terms for the great Oba Akachi? He was accustomed to people bowing for his favor. But then, he looked at the beast, which had cost him more than the entire village was worth, and which now stood lifeless, a monument to his powerlessness. His empire was teetering on the edge of disaster, he was missing critical board meetings, deals worth billions were hanging in the balance. He had tried logic, wealth, and technology. All had failed. He spat into the dust. "Go! Tell her I accept. But if she fails, I will use my wealth to buy her father's scrapyard and turn it into a goat pen." He knew he was being petty, but the desperation was an acid eating away at his soul. Within the hour, Abibi arrived. She came alone, walking with slow, deliberate steps, carrying nothing but a small, worn leather pouch and a piece of cotton cloth. The contrast between her humble, burdened figure and the intimidating presence of the beast was a cinematic shock. Akachi stared at her stomach, the shame the village had pinned on her visible for all to see, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, pity. He quickly crushed it beneath his pride. Abibi ignored Oba Akachi completely. She circled the beast slowly, her bare feet silent on the hot earth. She did not touch it yet. She only looked, observing the way the dust settled on the car's curves, the unnatural angle of the front tire, the faint, almost invisible scratch on the expensive tinted window. She did not open her bag of tools. She was listening. She listened to the silence of the engine, a silence that was too absolute, too unnatural for a modern machine filled with moving parts. It was the silence of a held breath. Akachi, unable to contain his impatience, snapped, "Well? What is it? A coil? The transmission? The central processing unit? My city mechanics said it was a total system-wide failure, a cascade." Abibi finally turned, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. They were deep, steady, and utterly unimpressed by his anger or his expensive clothes. "You speak of a machine," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I speak of a spirit. This car did not fail, it refused. It refuses your journey. It refuses the oil, the fuel, the electricity. It is rejecting the life you gave it." Akachi felt a shiver trace his spine, a response that was purely primal. He scoffed again, louder this time, but his certainty was a thin shield against her absolute conviction. Abibi then walked to the front, and without looking at him, she reached into her pouch, not for a wrench, but for a handful of dry leaves, which she carefully crumbled onto the hood. She said, "I need 2 hours. Alone. And a bowl of clean water. Do not interrupt me." Akachi was stunned into silence. Abibi didn't begin the work with her hands, she began it with her spirit. She requested a fire, and Akachi, too desperate to refuse, grudgingly built a small, smoky fire using dry brushwood. Abibi used the fire to heat a small piece of metal she had taken from her pouch, an old, twisted bolt from her father's first machine. She then took the water and performed a simple, quiet washing ritual on her hands and face, cleansing the grease of the village, preparing for the grease of the beast. She opened the leather pouch, which contained only 3 things: the old twisted bolt, a small glass jar of her father's special lubricant mixture, and a worn, smooth stone etched with a sign that looked like a bird taking flight. She opened the engine bay and began to whisper, not to the engine, but to the cold metal housing. Her words were ancient, a dialect of Igboya that Akachi, despite his family name, barely understood. She spoke of the respect owed to the iron that bears the weight of the journey, the fire that turns fuel into speed, and the blood of the earth that flows through the wires. She was acknowledging the beast's internal conflict. She used the heated bolt to trace 3 circles on the dead battery casing, not to burn, but to warm and wake the spirit of the power. She then took the stone, knelt, and placed it gently in the dust beneath the engine block. Akachi watched this ritual, mesmerized and horrified. Every logical fiber in his body screamed that this was primitive madness, yet every failed attempt by his certified experts told him that logic was useless here. Abibi finally introduced her hands to the machine. She dismissed Akachi's sophisticated diagnostic scanner, a device worth a small fortune, with a wave of her hand. "This machine only tells you what it thinks is wrong," she explained. "It cannot tell you what the car feels." Her tools were simple: a few well-worn wrenches, a piece of sandpaper, and a thin, flexible piece of steel she had fashioned into a probe. She started at the heart of the beast, the massive, shielded engine control unit, ECU. Akachi, a software engineer by training, knew this was the digital soul of the car. If the ECU was dead, the car was dead. The city mechanics had been afraid to touch it, relying on their diagnostics. Abibi, however, approached it with the familiarity of a mother tending a child. She opened the casing gently. Inside was a complex matrix of circuit boards, wires, and microchips, a world away from the simple engines her father used to fix. Yet, Abibi didn't see the complexity. She saw 1,000 tiny, connected paths. She found the copper wire that had rejected the oil, the one that carried the cold dread, and followed its path deep into the ECU. She didn't see a burned circuit, she saw a blockage, a single point where the current, like a river, had decided to turn back on itself. It was a failure so subtle and deep that no sensor could report it. She did not use a soldering iron or fancy tools. She used the piece of sandpaper to clean a microscopic speck of corrosion, and then applied a tiny dab of her father's special lubricant to the contact points, sealing the connection. It was an act of profound, almost religious simplicity, a small gesture that connected the old knowledge to the new complexity. The news of Abibi, the ostracized, pregnant woman, working on the famous Oba Akachi's impossible car, spread through Igboya like a fire in the dry grass. Soon, a small crowd had gathered far down the road, close enough to watch, but afraid to approach the scene of the curse. MMA Zina was there, leaning on her staff, her face unreadable. The rest of the women whispered, a mixture of hope and malice bubbling up. If Abibi failed, her shame would be absolute and permanent. If she succeeded, the very foundation of their judgment, that she was unblessed, would crumble. Abibi, oblivious to the scrutiny, was completely absorbed in the machine. Her concentration was a physical shield. The heat was relentless, and the effort of bending and twisting over the engine, with the baby pressing against her ribs, was exhausting. She had to pause several times, breathing deeply, her hand on her belly, resting on the fender. Akachi, watching her from the shade of a small, scrubby tree, saw her struggle. He saw the sheer physical effort, the exhaustion that was not weakness, but a consequence of her burdened state. For the first time, he saw her as a person, not just a strange mechanic or a superstitious villager. He even found himself taking a bottle of chilled water from his emergency stash and walking over, offering it silently. Abibi accepted it without a word or a glance, drank half, and returned immediately to her work. The simple act of shared water, the common human connection, bridged the massive chasm of wealth and status between them. Abibi moved to the second point of refusal, the fuel line. It was not clogged, but it refused to draw fuel. Again, the city experts had checked and replaced the pump, to no avail. Abibi understood that the flow was blocked by intent, not debris. She saw the machine as a body, the ECU was the brain, the fuel line was the vein, and the fuel was the blood. If the brain was healed, but the vein still refused to carry blood, the body would not wake. She used a small piece of leather to wrap around a joint in the fuel injector rail. She then poured a tiny measure of her father's lubricant, it smelled of burnt sugar and crushed herbs, over the wrapped leather. She applied pressure, not to tighten the joint, but to coax it, whispering a traditional blessing for safe passage over the metal. The pressure she exerted, subtle yet powerful, was a dance of strength and precision. She was not forcing the machine, she was convincing it. Akachi watched, fascinated by the intensity of her focus. Her face was grimy, her breathing ragged, but her eyes held the fierce, pure light of a master at work. He suddenly realized the true depth of the difference between her and his city team. They worked on the machine, she worked with it. Finally, with a sharp, almost silent click, the fuel line seemed to exhale. A small, almost invisible bubble of air escaped, and Abibi immediately pressed the joint tight. She stepped back, wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of black grease on her forehead, and nodded once. The ritual was complete. Now came the final, terrifying test. Watch out for the concluding part in our next story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.